course, we can understand because your atria is smaller compared to your ventricle. Okay, so let us go to the different waves that is seen in the ECG. So this is the first component, your P wave, and the location is that it precedes the QRS complex. So a normal ECG should have a PQRS state. So you can say that it is normal if the P is always followed by a QRS complex. The amplitude is usually 2 to 3 mm high and the duration is 0.06 to 0.12 seconds. So its configuration is usually rounded and upright, and the deflection, these are seen as positive deflection or upright in leads 1 to AVF and V2 to V6. In V1, you can see varying morphologies of your P wave. So your lead V1 is not the best lead to examine your P wave. So there are variations of your P wave. You can have a peaked P wave. This is usually seen in patients with right atrial hypertrophy. That means the right atrium hypertrophies, so there is greater area for the impulse conduction that will then be deflected in your ECG as a peaked P waves. You also have this broad notched P waves. So this will have a notch at the tip of your P wave. This usually signifies the presence of left atrial hypertrophy. PR interval. So the location is that it extends from the beginning of the P, so here, up to the beginning of the QRS complex. So this is what you call as the PR interval. And usually the normal PR interval is 0.12 to 0.20 seconds. So you have to remember this because when we talk about blocks, you have to know the normal duration of the PR interval. So these are different variations. So when we talk about short PR, so this indicates impulse originated in an area other than the SA node. Meaning, because there are, your impulse in the atrium can arise from any part actually of the sinus node. It's just that your sinus node is the pacemaker of the heart. So more often than not, the impulse will arise from the sinus node. But there are times when there are irregular foci in your right or left atrium that will fire first before your sinus node can fire. So in that scenario, you may have or you may be able to produce a short PR interval. So this is associated with junctional dysrhythmia and pre-excitation syndrome. So you don't really have to know this at this point in time, just enough for you to know that there is such a thing as a short PR interval in which the impulse does not come from your sinoatrial node. You also have a prolonged PR interval. So this indicates that the impulse is delayed. So meaning the travel of the impulse from your SA node to your AV node takes a little time. So if there is delay, it should be more than 0.2. So anything more than 0.2 seconds is already considered abnormal because that goes beyond the normal travel of the conduction from your SA to your AV node. So this is just an example. This is associated with patients who has first degree AV block and those who are taking digoxin. So your digoxin can lead to toxicity, especially if the creatinine is elevated. It cannot be excreted, so it can cause glycoside toxicity, and one of the manifestations of this is prolonged PR interval. QRS. So of course this follows the PR interval. And the amplitude differs for the chest and the limb leads. So for the chest leads, it's usually bigger, but it should not be more than 10 millimeters. While in the limb leads, it is smaller and it should not be bigger than 5 millimeters. So the normal duration is 0.6 to 0.10. Actually, I think the book says it's 0.06 to 0.08. The configuration, usually the Q wave is deflected downwards, the R wave is deflected upward, and the S wave is deflected downward. But sometimes you cannot see this Q wave even if it is a normal ECG. So sometimes the lead placement can cause that this Q wave will not be manifested in your 12-lead ECG, but that does not mean that the patient has an abnormal ECG. Okay, so the deflection of your QRS complexes. So it is usually positive, meaning more on the upright deflection in 1, 2, 3, AVL, AVF, and in your V4 to V6. Why in V4 to V6? Because the direction is going to the impulse will be conducted first, and the impulse generated will depolarize the left ventricle first. So your V6 is located more on the left, so your leads on the left side will more or less be deflected positively. So this is C as a negative deflection in V1 to V3 because your leads V1 to V3 are located more on the right. So the impulse is traveling. When it depolarizes the ventricular septum, it usually it travels from your left to right, so there will be greater negative deflection in your QRS in V1 to V3 as well as in the AVR. So there are also variations. So you can have a widened QRS complex. So meaning the impulse conduction in the ventricle is lower. So this is seen in patients with bundle branch block. So remember that your bundle of his divides into two. It bifurcates into two, right? One will supply the left and the other one will supply the right. So if there are blockage in both bundle branch or even in one of them, you can have a delayed impulse conduction in your ventricle. So that will translate into a wide QRS complex. This is also seen in these types of abnormalities in the ECG, like if you have premature ventricular contraction, or if you have ventricular tachycardia, or a patient with idioventricular rhythm. So these are the different forms of your QRS. So you can have this normal QRS pattern, which you see. You can have a QR pattern, especially in patients who had healed infarction. You can have, as I mentioned earlier, you can have a deflection that is all pointing upward without a Q and an S, but this does not mean that it is abnormal. You can have a small R big S QRS pattern that is usually seen in your V1 to V3, an equal RS pattern that is usually at the point of transition, wherein there is equal forces of the negative and the positive electrodes. So the deflection that is being reflected will be more or less the same. That will manifest as the R wave and the S wave in your ECG. You can also have a QS pattern, meaning the small upward deflection in your V1 to V3 is not seen, or in patients with healed infarction as well. And a QR pattern. So the same thing, this manifests a healed infarction. So next we go to the ST segment. So this extends from the end of the S wave to the beginning of your T wave. So normally the deflection here is isoelectric, meaning it is just a line. So zero deflection. So not going up, not going down, but it should be more or less parallel or at about the same level with your PR segment. So you have to take note of this one when we are considering ischemia or infarction, because this PR segment will be our basis if there is deviation from your ST segment. So variation. So when we talk about ST segment elevation, so take note. So this is your, what is this? P wave. So your ST is located somewhere else. So it is located way above your PR segment. So this signifies myocardial injury, or that what we see as an ST segment elevation in your ECG, just the same as what the case is telling you sa handout 2, because the patient did not follow the doctor's advice, so he was rushed to the emergency room with chest pains, and on ECG there was anterolateral wall infarction or injury. So this is what they saw in the ECG. So when we say about anterolateral wall, what leads are involved?
V3 to V6.
V4 to V6 or V3 to V6. ST segment depression, just like what was manifested during the stress test. So this also indicates presence of ischemia. So basically, this is what happened. This is your PR segment, and the ST segment is formed below the PR segment. So this will already signify presence of ischemia. So I hope by this time you do not see an ECG as this one. Random letter and number, a spiky part, an up part, another spiky part, a bumpy part of unknown significance, and a flat part. So now that you know the significance of your ST segment, so we know what V2 is, we can relate with the different deflection that is seen here, and we know that if there is a bumpy part that is located way above the PR segment, it indicates anterior wall, it indicates infarction. So anterior wall, this involves what lead?
3, 6.
Anterior. V3, V4, or V1 to V4. Okay, so let's move on. The T wave. So this follows your S wave. The amplitude is usually 5 millimeters or less in the lymph leads, and it can go as high as 10 mm or less in your chest leads. So the configuration is more or less the same with your P wave, but it's more or less larger. The deflection is usually positive, and this is only negative in the ABR. The rest of the segment, the rest of the leads in the ECG, if it is normal, it will show you an upward T wave deflection. But sometimes this can be very non-specific in your leads 3 and V1 and V2. So there are also variations in your T wave. When you happen to see a T wave that is inverted, so this also signifies myocardial ischemia. So you already have two ECG changes when you talk about ischemia. It's either a T wave inversion or an ST depression. So you also have such a thing as peak T wave, that is, so normally the T wave is less than 10 millimeters. If it goes beyond that, So more than two big squares in your ECG, so that would already signify the presence of peak T waves. And you have to be very careful in patients with peak T waves because this signifies a metabolic abnormality, particularly elevated potassium levels. And if you have hyperkalemia, this can be life-threatening because it can degenerate into sine wave and will degenerate further into ventricular tachycardia and fibrillation. So when you have a peak T wave, you have to be very careful, you have to search for the cause. And more often than not, the cause is an elevated potassium level. So this is usually seen in patients who are on hemodialysis, and they miss dialysis, so they're not able to excrete the waste products as well as some electrolytes in the body, so it accumulates, creating your hyperkalemia, and it would translate to a peak T wave in your ECG. QT interval. So when we talk about QT interval, we talk about the depolarization and repolarization. So depolarization would include your QRS complex, right? And your repolarization, we are talking about the T wave. So the entire thing from the Q wave deflection at the start of your QRS until the end of your T wave, that's what we call as the QT interval. So this extends from the beginning of the QRS and at the end of the T wave, and normally it measures 0.36 to 0.44. So anything beyond that, it's already a prolonged QT, and it also has a significance. Below that 0.36, it also has a significance. So you know, everything in the ECG, it may seem like just ups and downs or spikes, but they all mean important equivalence that occurs in the body. So one variation is the prolonged QT interval. So this indicates prolonged ventricular repolarization. That means that the relative refractory period is longer. So there will be a prolonged QT interval, and this may be due to another electrolyte, which is your calcium. So hypocalcemia can lead to prolonged QT interval. You also have such a thing as shortened QT interval, and this may be manifested in patients who have cardiac glycoside toxicity, or of course the opposite of hypocalcemia, hypercalcemia. So this should be taken into consideration because a short QT or a prolonged QT can be the initial manifestation in patients who will have fatal arrhythmia. Katong magkalit na arrest because they develop ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia that is brought about by these changes. So if you take note of this, so you can save your patient from dying. You wave. So the last wave in the ECG, this represents the repolarization of the His-Purkinje system, and it follows your T wave. Configuration is usually upright, and of course the deflection is upright, but this cannot be seen normally in a normal ECG. More often than not, these U waves are being seen in patients with hypokalemia. Especially if you are presented with a patient with diarrhea and vomiting or severely dehydrated and you get an ECG, you can sometimes see the presence of your urine. So ECG pa lang, you